In this lesson, we'll begin creating the main stylized material for all the objects in our scene. Let's begin. Our first step is to make sure that you've downloaded and unzipped all of the resources for the class. If you're following along on YouTube, you can download the assets for free from my Gumroad store. The link for the free download is in the description below. After you've downloaded the sci-fi manga ClassAssets.zip file, we'll need to unzip it so that we can access all of the files inside of it. On a Windows computer, all you need to do is right-click on this file, the one with the folder with the zipper icon on it, and then choose Extract All. Here you can choose where it's going to extract the files to, and whether or not to open the file once it's extracted. After extracting the folder, I suggest you move it to a location that you can find easily later. I definitely wouldn't leave this folder in your Downloads folder. My suggestion would be either to put it in a Documents folder, or just on your desktop somewhere that you can find later. Inside this folder that we just extracted, you'll see some Blender files and folders with reference images and textures in them. You should see all the same files you see here, aside from this folder here, which you have already extracted. So you should see 4 different Blender files, and then 2 folders, one called Reference Images and one called Textures. These items will all be important later, but for now we're going to double click on the starter file _sci-fi manga _01 Blender file to open it in Blender. This is another good time to remind you that Blender version 4.4 or later is required to use these starter files without having any issues. If you're using an older version of Blender, I would highly recommend that you update to Blender version 4.4 or later to follow along with this class. As I mentioned in the introduction of this class, we'll be using a panel from the 1996 manga called Blame as our main inspiration for the look of the render. This manga is well known for its stunning depictions of a gargantuan landscape simply known as the city. I'll spare you the complete synopsis of the manga, but the absolute basics of the story is humanity used to control machines to build the city for their needs. They lost their control over these machines thousands of years ago, and now the machines continue to build the city without any input from humans. The humans are actually considered invaders by the machines, and now live in fear of them. The main artistic aspect of the city, however, is that it's an incomprehensibly large structure that is built with no particular logic and without humans in mind. This results in nonsensical architecture that is almost anti-human. Examples of this might be hallways that extend for hundreds of miles with no doorways that end in a sudden dead end, or elevators that take weeks to reach the bottom of, or even simple things such as rickety staircases over massive gaps that have no handrails to prevent you from falling. Now that we know a little bit about this world, what are the key elements that we want to isolate from the visuals of our reference image? The most obvious aspect is the stark black and white appearance of the image. While manga is predominantly a black and white medium, Blame takes a particularly heavy-handed approach to the contrast in the image. Next, we'll see that the environment fades into darkness as the walls extend into the distance. This can be accomplished with lighting, however we'll be using a Z-depth pass later on to get this effect. Walls have cracks and streaks along them and are generally covered in huge amounts of wear and tear as the city ages through the years. The material that we'll be creating for our scene will capture a lot of these details, but we'll also be using grease pencil to add even more detail and accentuate the ones that are already there. Lastly, the image features a pretty obvious paper texture, thanks to it being a page from an actual manga book. We can see a pretty good example of that here on the center of this wall inside this gradient. To give our render that same paper-like feeling, we'll be adding a few overlays using the compositor in Blender to create paper lines and fibers. We could be here for quite a while calling out all of the amazing details from the manga, but I think at this point we have a pretty good idea of what our goal is if we want to replicate the same feeling. In the Reference Images folder in the class assets that you downloaded earlier, you can find a few more reference images from the same manga. Each of these images shares many details while also featuring new ones. So go ahead and look through these if you just wanted to get a better idea of what this world looks like and the feeling that the artist has captured. With all of the exposition out of the way, we're ready to begin working on the first aspect of our render, the object material. While the material for this scene does a lot of heavy lifting for the overall look, it's really not all that complicated to create. I'll be explaining a good bit during this first section, so while it's not all that complicated, it will be a bit longer than the average lesson. So let's jump right in. First, we'll need to switch to the shading workspace found here at the top. We can get there just by clicking on this tab. Now that we're in the shading workspace, we can see here that I've customized the layout for us slightly. The top left viewport will display our rendered image once we've rendered it. The top right will display our 3D viewport, set to the camera view currently. and the bottom viewport is set to our shader editor. This is where we'll be creating the material. In this class, I won't be explaining every single aspect of how materials work within Blender. However, if you follow along with all the steps you see on screen, you'll have no issues creating the material. If you're interested in a more thorough explanation of all the basics of material creation in Blender, I'd recommend my Magic of Materials class found on Skillshare. Before we start adding any new nodes to our material, let's enable a built-in add-on called Node Wrangler. This will make our lives a lot easier as we create the material. To do this, we're going to go up here to Edit, then go down to Preferences. Now we can go to the Add-ons tab here in this window. Then up here in the search bar, we're going to type in the word Node, N-O-D-E, and then here we can see it popped up, Node Wrangler. If you're not able to see this, make sure that you don't have Enabled Only checked on. You should have this box checked off, and then down here, once you see Node Wrangler, just check this box next to it to make sure that you enable it. This add-on is really useful for quickly adding support nodes to our material with just a single click. If you already had this add-on enabled, obviously just leave it turned on. Now that you have Node Wrangler turned on, we can just close this window. Okay, now it's time to add some new nodes. We'll be using this Node Wrangler add-on to do this in a much more efficient way. First thing we need to do is go down here to the shader editor on the bottom, and then we can click here on this principled BSDF node, the one with the green bar at the top, and then we'll hit Control, Shift, and T at the same time on our keyboard, and then we'll navigate to the Textures folder that we unzipped in a previous lesson. This was included in the class assets for this class. Inside that Textures folder, you'll find a bunch of different images here. The images that we need right now are these metal plates images found here. So first, we're going to select this metal plates 008 image, and then we can hold Shift, go down to the last metal plates image, click that one, and then that'll select all three of these. With all three of these images selected, we can go down here and click this blue button. As a quick side note, all three of these images are from a really great website called ambientcg.com. All of the assets on this website are completely free to use, even for commercial projects, so it's a fantastic resource. I really recommend that you check it out at some point to see what they have. Okay, so we have our texture images loaded, and we'll notice that the Node Wrangler add-on even did some setup for us. So if we use our mouse wheels down here on this bottom window, we can zoom out to see all these different nodes that Node Wrangler has connected for us. One important thing to note is that these orange nodes that symbolize the images that we selected in the previous window are all named after the name of the image. Because we're creating a non-photorealistic stylized material, it really doesn't matter too much what the original purpose of these images were, only how they look and the data that we can extract from them. This is particularly obvious with this bottom image here, the normal image. This image isn't even black and white, but we'll be converting it into one for our purposes later. So if you are familiar a little bit with how materials work, I wouldn't get too caught up on the fact that this is a normal image, and that this is a displacement, and this is an ambient occlusion image. We're just using these for basically just the image itself. We're not really concerned with what they used to be made for. Now let's do some rearranging of these nodes to make them more useful for our purposes. Our first step is going to be adjusting the texture nodes, these ones here with the orange bars at the top. First, let's go up here to this ambient occlusion texture, so we can select this. And then we're going to click on this drop down here that says color space, and then switch it from non-color to sRGB instead. This will add a bit more contrast to this image by changing how Blender interprets the black and white values. Now we'll go here to where it says flat. We're going to click on this drop down and then switch it instead to box. This allows Blender to project the image from 3 different directions rather than just one. Due to us using this material on nearly every object in the scene, we want to make sure that it's as universal as possible. Projecting the image from multiple directions means that it will be more likely to fit regardless of the object that it's applied to. Now let's adjust the other 2 images. So we're going to scroll down. On this one here, this displacement image, we're going to again go to flat and then switch it to box. For this image, we can leave it set to non-color for the color space. We don't need to switch that. And then the very last image, this normal image, we'll again click flat and then switch it to box. And again, we'll leave this color space set to non-color. Now that we have a few of these nodes adjusted, let's clean up some of the ones that we don't need. So we're going to zoom out using our mouse wheel. Then we're going to click and drag over these 3 nodes here on the right side. And then we can just delete them by hitting the delete key on our keyboard. And then next, we're going to select this black box that's behind these images and then hit delete. And then again, we're going to select this black box and then delete that as well. Those black boxes that we just deleted are called frames, and we don't really need them because right now they're attaching these nodes together in ways that isn't super useful to us for this material. They were auto-generated by the Node Wrangler add-on and are generally a good idea to use, but in this case they're just going to complicate things for us. So we'll remove them for now. And then the last thing that we need to delete is this small purple dot found here connecting all of these nodes together. So we're just going to drag select over this and then delete this dot. That little dot there is called a reroute node, and it's a way just to clean up some of these wires so that it's not quite so many things overlapping. But in our case, we don't really need it. Before we move on to our next step of adding brand new nodes, you might have noticed that these image textures here are overlapping each other. And that's because when we changed the setting from flat to box, it added a few new categories here which made them a little bit larger. To reposition these, all you have to do is click on them and then just drag them out of the way. So here, now they're no longer overlapping. Okay, so now we're ready to add brand new nodes. So to do this, we're going to hit Shift and A at the same time. That'll bring up our add menu. Then we can go here where it says search. We'll click on the search bar, and then we're going to type in diffuse, D-I-F-F. We'll choose diffuse, BSDF, and then we can place that over here on the right side. And again, we're going to add two more new ones. So we'll hit Shift and A to bring up the add menu, search, and then this time we'll type in mix, M-I-X. We're going to choose mix color, the second option. We'll place that again over here on the right side. And then one last node, we'll hit Shift and A, search, and then type in value, V-A-L, and we'll choose value found here at the top. And then this one over here, we're going to place to the left. So first, let's get the left side of the system set up. We're going to zoom in over here so we can see these nodes a bit better. We're going to start by connecting the value node that we just added, and we're going to plug it in down here into the scale socket on this mapping node. This will simplify the three directional scale values that we had into just a singular value. This isn't necessary, but it makes adjusting the scale a little bit less tedious as there's only one number to adjust instead of three of them. Now let's zoom out a bit, and then you can click in your middle mouse button here to pan back and forth. And then we're going to select this top left node here, this texture coordinates node, and we're going to drag it over here to the left to make some room as we'll need this gap here. So we just want to separate these a bit. They're still connected, we can see the wire, we just need some room here. Now we're going to drag select over these two nodes, and then move them up here next to this image. Now we're going to make two more copies of these two nodes. So make sure you have them selected. So just drag select over them if they're not highlighted in orange like they are now. And then we're going to hit Shift and D on our keyboard for duplicate. We're going to duplicate these down here and then left click to place them. Then we're going to do this one more time. We're going to move down a little bit, hit Shift and D, duplicate, and then place them just below. So we need three groupings of these. Each one of these is going to correspond to each image. So let's reposition these so that they line up a bit better. So we can just drag this down so it lines up with this one, and then drag this down so it lines up with the middle. Now we're going to connect each of these three groupings back to this texture coordinate node. Before we do this, however, we do need to switch the mode that this is using. Right now it's plugged into the UV channel. We want to use the object channel instead. To change this, we're going to zoom out slightly, and then we're going to plug this object. We're going to drag from object, and we're going to move it up here, and then plug it into this vector socket here found at the very top. We'll see here that it replaces the UV, and now it's using the object instead of the UV. Let's do this two more times. So we're going to go down here, drag from object, plug it into vector found here at the top, and then one more time, drag from object, plug it in here to vector. The reason we chose object is because it's the most universal and most likely to fit on a variety of different object shapes. This works perfectly for our needs, as we're going to be applying it to 99% of the objects within our scene, so we need it to be pretty universal and work in most cases. In this case, object is the best option for that. Now we can go to each of these three nodes here, and we're going to connect the vector from the top of this mapping down here to the vector on the bottom of this image. We'll do that 3 times. We'll go down here, do the middle, and then again the bottom. With all these nodes ready to go, we're going to start here in the middle with this one that's named displacement. Again, remember it's not actually the displacement image, that's just the name of the image that we're using. After we add all the nodes we need and get it fully connected to the system, we can go through the other two images, the top and the bottom, a little bit faster because we'll know most of the process by that point. Before we add any new nodes, let's just grab this mix node here, move it up to the top. We won't need it just yet. Now we can grab these two nodes here. We're going to drag select over these, drag them over to the right to make a bit more room. And then we can select just this green one here, this diffuse, and we're going to move it over here about in the center. Now let's add 2 brand new nodes. So we're going to hit Shift and A, go to Search, and then we'll type in Color, C-O-L-O-R. We're going to choose Color Ramp, the second option. We'll place that over here to the left. With this color ramp still selected, we're going to hit Shift and D to duplicate this to make a second one, and then place it over here on the far right, just before this other node. And then we're going to add one more brand new node by hitting Shift and A, Search. This time we'll type in Shader, S-H-A-D, and we're going to choose Shader to RGB, the third option here, and then place it between these two. With these new nodes added, let's zoom in here, and let's get them all connected. So we're going to drag from here, this top color socket, down to the factor socket here, again from the color socket to the color socket on this diffuse. Then we'll drag from this BSDF to the shader socket found here at the bottom. And then another time we're going to go color to factor, and we can move this over a little bit to make a bit more room. We're going to plug in the color to the surface, which is the very top socket here on the material output. Before we go too much further with this texture, let's make sure we go to the top right viewport and set it to the rendered view. We can do that by clicking this far right button here, and then we'll see our viewport here update in a moment. And now we can see a bit more accurate representation of what our image actually looks like. We won't see anything too exciting yet, but it'll be more obvious as we start adjusting settings. As a quick note, if you're unable to see these buttons here on the far right, you might need to click in your middle mouse button on this option bar and pan it back and forth. You can slide it all the way over to the left so that you can reveal these buttons here on the right side. Now that we have everything connected together, let's start from left to right and go through each of these nodes and adjust their settings. We're going to start over here with this value node. So we're going to zoom in here and make sure you're adjusting the value node that's attached to this displacement image. So it should be part of this same chain. So we can zoom into value. Then we're going to click on this number here and we're going to set it to 37.3 and then hit enter. As I mentioned before, this value node is what controls the scale of our texture. It's just using one number and then plugging it into the X, the Y, and the Z values. When it was set to 0 before, it was scaled down to essentially nothing, so we didn't see anything. It was infinitely small. We've switched the number, but before we notice any changes, we're actually going to need to go over here to the top of the mapping node and switch the type from point to texture instead. By switching it from point to texture, we've adjusted the way that Blender interprets these values. In the case of this texture type that we just switched to, the larger the scale value, the larger the texture appears on the model. So if we go down here and adjust this value and make it larger just by sliding it up, we can see that the image gets bigger on the model. And then if we adjust it down, the image gets smaller. I'm going to hit Ctrl Z to undo that, as 37.3 in our case works pretty well. Another change we need to make is over here on this location settings here inside this mapping node. This change isn't technically necessary. However, in the case of this class, I've built the scene to work specifically with these values. So we're going to adjust our Y location to 16.01, hit enter. You'll notice that it cuts off this number. It is still 16.01. It's just simplifying the visual here to 16. And then for our Z, we're going to type in -5.73 and then hit enter. So we'll notice that these adjustments have simply moved the texture around on the objects. It just slid it around on the Y and the Z direction. In our particular case, it moves the images around on the walls to spots that I thought looked better when I was creating our scene. This is important for this class in particular though, because a lot of the grease pencil details that I drew onto my render were embellishing some of the texture elements. If I don't have the texture in the exact same spot, then my drawing that I import later on in this class won't match up to the locations that it should be. If you don't plan on using my imported grease pencil drawings at all in your personal render, feel free to adjust the X, Y, and Z locations to wherever you think looks nice. However, if you have any interest in using my drawings as a base for your own work, which is totally fine, be sure to use the exact locations that I just typed in so that everything lines up. Otherwise, when you import my drawings, you might notice that some of the details don't really match up with what you're seeing. And that's because the texture was assumed to be in one location and it's now in another. With our mapping node finalized, we can now zoom out. We're going to go over here to this first color ramp. So let's zoom in here so we can get a better look. Now it's time to strip all of the gray values out of this image and make it really high contrast. And we'll be doing that with this color ramp node. Let's go down here and make a few changes. So first we're going to select this linear dropdown and we're going to instead switch it to constant. Next, we're going to select this white slider here by clicking this tiny triangle at the top of it. Or you can simply go down here to this bottom left and type in 1 or 0. So 0 would be the left slider, 1 is the right slider. So once you have it selected, you should see a 1 here and then a white bar at the bottom. Now we're going to adjust the position of this. So you could normally just drag it left and right, and you can see here it's changing the position of it. Or down here, you'll notice that this number changes as well. So we're going to type in an exact number here, type in 0.17, and then hit enter, and that'll put it exactly where we need it to be. We'll notice that after changing the gradient type from linear to constant, we've completely removed all gray values from this gradient. It's basically just black or white with a hard transition between. This makes the image really high contrast. And then by adjusting the position of this slider here, the white slider, we've changed the amount of white and black in the image. So in this case, we made a lot more white in the image and a lot less black. So by removing most of the black values, we can zoom in here and see that all we've left behind are basically just these cracks and lines in the texture. If we moved it back up, we can see that those cracks grow, but really all we want are just these lines. So we're going to leave it at a really low value. With this color ramp done, we're ready to move on to the diffuse BSDF, which is directly next to it. We won't be making any changes to this node, but it's important nonetheless. When combined with this very next node, the shader to RGB, it allows us to convert all of the previous nodes to the left, over here, into color data rather than shader data. By converting the shader into color data instead, we can manipulate the way that light interacts with the material in stylistic ways. This is really key to the look of our scene. So now that these two nodes have worked together to convert the shader data into color data instead, we can now adjust this here, the second color ramp. This is where the shader to RGB node to the left is really allowed to shine. We can now filter this entire material, including the way that light reacts to the surface, through this color ramp node. This allows us to have fine control over the amounts of highlights and shadows, as well as the brightness or darkness of these elements. The main thing that we'll be changing is the color of the black slider. While the reference image that we're using as a guide has really stark contrast between the highlight and the shadow, we'll be achieving that with other effects later on. So we want to make sure that the shadows aren't quite pure black for this material. As such, we want to make sure that we don't lose the gray values in our render when the shadows are applied on top of them. To do this, all we need to do is go down here to this left slider, so the black one, which is currently already selected. Then we can click on this black bar at the bottom to adjust the color. All we need to adjust is just this value here. We're going to make it just slightly brighter. So we can click on value, type in 0.025, and then hit enter. This very slight brightening of the shadows will also make sure that our grease pencil shows up while drawing in the shadows. So that allows us to add details on this side here that's entirely in shadow. Because this isn't pure black, we can draw pure black lines on top of it, and they'll still show up on this really dark gray. And just as a quick example, while we won't be doing this for our image, you can see just by moving these sliders back and forth, we're not changing the light in our scene at all, we're just changing how it's interpreted by this surface. So if you wanted a really interesting and very stark look, you could possibly pull these together to make a really tight transition between the colors, or you could even invert them by pulling them past each other and flipping the colors and making an inverted image. So you can see just how powerful this combination of nodes is. For now, we're just going to slide these back to where they were, so the white all the way to the far right, and then the black all the way to the far left. Alright, so now that we have a basic idea of what we'll be doing for each of the three texture images, let's go through the next two images a good bit faster, now that we're familiar with what each step does. I'll stop and explain anything new or noteworthy though. So we're going to zoom out, go over here to the top image, one named Ambient Occlusion. We'll go to the Value node. We're going to change this to 15, so 1.5, hit enter. Then we'll go to the Mapping node, switch the type from point to texture. Now we can zoom out. We're going to move this Mix node over here to the right. Then we'll hit Shift and A, go to Search, type in Color Ramp, C-O-L-O-R, then choose Color Ramp here. Place it next to this Ambient Occlusion. We'll plug in color into this bottom socket down here at the bottom. We can zoom in on the color ramp, switch from linear to constant. Then we'll select this far right slider by clicking the small triangle here above it. And then down in this position, we're going to type in 0.7 to move it to the left. And now we need to use this mix color node that we made earlier. So we can zoom out here. Our first step is going to be making room for it. So we're going to drag select over all four of these far right nodes, including this diffuse node. So we'll select all four of these. We're going to drag them over to the right to make some room. Now this mix node, we're going to drag down here to get it into position. Now we can zoom in, and we're going to drag from this color socket on this new color ramp that we just made at the top. We're going to drag that down into the A socket down here. We'll drag from this color ramp, the one we just worked on before. We're going to plug that into B, and then we're going to drag from the result, and then plug that down here into the diffuse. We're going to plug that right into the color. Now let's zoom into this mix node to start adjusting some of the settings. This mix node does exactly what it sounds like. It mixes images. So in this case up here, we can see now that we're seeing new spots on this wall, and that's because of this image that we just added, the ambient occlusion. So we can adjust the way that this mix node mixes these two images though. So first we're going to change from mix mode, and we're going to switch it to multiply instead. And then we'll go down here to the factor slider, and we're just going to click and drag this all the way to the right so it's set to 1. Switching from mix to multiply changes the way that Blender combines these two images. Multiply tells Blender to remove all the white parts of the image and only overlay the black parts of the image in slot B on top of slot A. This allows us to combine a lot of different images into one more complex image. And then setting the factor slider from 0.5 to 1 simply adjusts the opacity of the B image. So by setting it to 1, we're allowing the full opacity of image B to overlay on image A. We'll notice that if we lower this, we can see that parts of the image up here in particular start to disappear as we're overlaying less of image B. In our case, we want to overlay them entirely, so we're going to leave it set to 1. And that's it for the top image, so now we can move on to the last image down here at the bottom. So we can zoom out, go down here to the one named normal, and we're going to adjust the value. So we'll click on value and type in 101.7. So 101.7 for the value. Now we can go to the mapping, change the type from point to texture. And then for this image, we are going to move it again on the location. So we'll type in, for the X value, type in 10.64, hit enter. And then for the Z, we'll type in negative 4.25 and then hit enter. Now let's zoom out. And then over here to the right, we're going to hit Shift and A, go to search, type in color, and we'll choose color ramp, place that to the right. Now we can connect the color socket to the factor socket down here on the bottom. Now let's zoom into this color ramp. Again, we'll switch it from linear to constant, select the right slider, the white one on the right. And then for the position, we'll type in 0.45 and then hit enter. With our color node set up, we can zoom out. And then we're going to select this mix color node, this yellow one here, and then hit Shift and D to make a duplicate and place it here to the right just below, right around here. This duplicated node already has all the settings changed for us, so we might as well just reuse it. We can make the process of connecting this node a little bit easier by simply dragging it and then dragging it here and placing it on top of this line. We'll see that as we drag over top of it, this line turns white instead of yellow, and then when we let go, we'll see that it automatically connects it for us. In this case, it's plugged the result into the A socket and then connected the result from here over into the diffuse BSDF. Now all we need to do is to connect this color ramp found down here. We're going to connect this color socket into the B socket found here on the bottom. This chaining of mix nodes that we just did here allows us to combine two images together and then combine that result with another image. This is an important concept that we'll be using quite a lot later on in this class. And that's it for the basics of this material. If we zoom out here, we can see that we have 3 different images, all adjusted with this color ramp to make them a little bit more contrasty, combined together, and then combined together again, fed over here into this diffuse BSDF, into the shadered RGB, adjusted with this color ramp, removing the black from the image and changing it instead to a dark gray. And then if we check our image over here, we can see that we have multiple layers of grunge overlaid to create a pretty interesting pattern already. We're not done with it just yet, but we can see that we have cracks and lines, we have panel lines and breaks, and it's starting to come together. Soon we'll be adding some new effects to make it look even better. In the next lesson, we'll finish creating the object material. I'll see you there.